All right. Hello. Welcome to our Wednesday lunch study break. It is Wednesday, February 23rd, 2022. And today we are going to follow up on the Scholar in Residence weekend that we had this past Shabbat, where we had Rabbi David Galinkin, who is the president of the Schechter Institutes, come and talk with us about two main topics, and I want to share with you. I'm not sure I don't think any of you were with us, so this is going to be interesting. I was going to ask you which one you wanted to get into first, but what I want to do first is share with you a little bit of his overview that he provided us in terms of how he goes about thinking about halacha. And then we'll take a look at some of the texts and some of the teshuvot, some of the responsa that he has written. Oh, there's still people coming in. Okay, great. All right, so let's just share a little bit about Rabbi Galinkin. So Rabbi Galinkin is the head of the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. He made Aliyah in 1972. He spent 20 years on the Rabbinical Assembly's Law Committee. And for the past, what did he say? 20 years, he's been serving as the posek of the Masorti International Movement. And that requires, he says he's written 700 responsa, 200 of which have been published. And I thought what I'd like to do, thinking about this post-COVID era that we are entering into, is think about the nature of Jewish denominations, the nature of the conservative movement. So today, what I'd like to do is do a review and use some of his controversies as a way to see how he balances the scales. And then next week, I'd love for us to begin a conversation about the history of American Jewish denominations, how they formed. Maybe we can look at some of the foundational texts from the Reform movement and the conservative movement and the Reconstructionist movement and renewal. And we can think about, hey, if we were to create a new movement now that would be responding, are these movements good for where we are now? Or do we, in that same spirit of Mordechai Kaplan 100 years ago when he was writing his Reconstructionist foundational documents, didn't turn into a movement for another 40 years, but do we find ourselves in a similar situation? And so what I want to start with, Rabbi Galinkin on Friday night gave a rather long class on this topic of who is a Jew in the state of Israel. That is not David Galinkin. I believe that's a Dean Steinfaltz, by the way. And he provided two approaches to his opinion, one in a full thought out teshuva, and that synopsis, that briefer synopsis in the Jerusalem Post. I don't want to start there because that is very dense and it has to do with not politics, but precise points of halacha, and in particular, what authority carries the day, and what is ultimately the long-standing tradition. So I'm not going to start there, but I'm going to start with where he began at his shiur on Shabbat afternoon, which is, how does he operate as a posek? What are the principles that he applies? And so let me show you the handout that he provided. So here are the sources. I can put this handout. Did anybody? Yeah, why don't I do that? Why don't I stick this handout in the chat? Hold on one second. All right, there you go. And here it is here. And basically, how does Jewish law get established? All right, if you've been coming to our Torah study sessions, we've been doing the 10 Commandments, we've been talking about Mishpatim. And he joked when he was here that for the most part in Israel, Jewish education goes from the Tanakh to the Palmach. That was his joke, and that the Mishnah and the Talmud, for the most part, are not known in the state of Israel. And so if thinking about how the sources and development of Jewish law, how does it work? This is his overarching concept. So let me just share with you briefly. We start with the Tanakh, obviously, from our Bible. And then in this first couple of centuries after the year zero, if you will, there are the Mishnaic, these Braitot, these Midrashes, this Tosefta, which are texts and laws. That's followed by 400 years of the establishment of the Talmud, which is questions and answers on those Mishnahs, followed by commentaries, codes, and responsa. So the commentary most famous are from Rashi or for Tosfot. The codes come from Maimonides in his Mishnah Torah, as well as in the Torah and the Shulhana with Rav Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, which were pretty much the key codes that are in operation today. And then there's also responsa, the Geonim, the Maharam, the Rashba, the Rosh, all the way down through Reb Moshe Feinstein, Reb Avadia Yosef, to the present day. And he says that that is the largest body of Jewish written material is actually found in our responsa literature. Okay, so how do we approach halacha for our time? What is the conservative approach? And what I'm going to do is present a controversy that he presented on Shabbat so that we can debate it here. And the controversy is going to be about the establishment of a minyan when people are not able to come together in person. He had to write a whole number of teshuvot in March of 2020, which he published. I have his book here, and we're going to take a look at one of them, and it concerns the establishment of minyanim, which was a topic that he discussed on Saturday. But before we get to that, I just want to share with you his approach, because I think in the next few weeks, let's consider what is our approach. Let's consider what is the approach that we want to go about resolving these. Do we still feel as if there is merit to this conservative approach? Is this approach too conservative for us? Or what might we suggest in its alternative? Okay, so here, this is what he went over here, and I'd like to go over these 6 basic principles, which is how he goes about deciding these controversies. Can everyone see? Do I need to make this bigger, or is this good enough? Good enough or bigger, Howard? Bigger. You want it bigger? I'll give it bigger for you. Absolutely. Here you go. Here you go, Howard. Principles in which they're better. All right. The conservative movement does not have one uniform set of principles guiding decision-making. And indeed, you know this already. We've talked about this. There are diverse approaches among our halachic authorities. However, Rabbi Galinkin taught us that close study of the responsa and the halachic studies written by conservative rabbis will reveal, or if you look at them for the past 70 years, this is written in 91, certain general principles by which we go about deciding. And so he's pretty much saying he's gone through the review of the literature, and he believes that we decide based upon these 6 general principles. Was there a question? Did someone have a question? Okay, so let's go through these principles, and I'm curious to know what you think of them. So the first one is, there is an attempt to preserve the tradition as much as possible. Changes are not made for their own sake, but rather to deal with an urgent, acute problem. Now, he was interested in focusing on this when he came to speak with us, because he says, you know, the moniker of the movement is tradition and change, and people forget the first word, he says. He likes to remind us that we're tradition. We believe in tradition. And conservative implies an attempt to conserve the tradition as much as possible. Changes are not going to be made just for the sake of making changes, but they have to be in response to an acute controversy or an acute problem. All right. Number 2, a lenient ruling is preferable to a strict one. Judaism is a way of life. And we adhere to the Talmudic saying, you shall keep my statutes and my laws, which if a man shall do, he shall live by them. That's from Leviticus. and not die because of them, right? We're not going to keep commandments that cost us our lives. For this reason, if the halakha permits a lenient ruling and a strict ruling on a given issue, the tendency is to pick the lenient ruling. This approach is firmly anchored in the halachic tradition. It is reflected in the well-known Talmudic saying, the strength of a lenient ruling is greater. It was emphasized by many of the great halachic authorities throughout the generations. He quotes Rabbi Menachem Hamiri of Provence, stretched this idea in his commentary on the Talmud, in which he writes, whenever a halachic problem is brought before a scholar and he can rule leniently, he should not feign piety and search out for too many stringencies, but rather take pity on the money of the Jewish people, for the Torah too takes pity on the money of the Jewish people. All right, a similar idea is expressed by Rabbi Yechiel Epstein, author of the Aruch HaShulchan. Says, when a question of ritual law comes before you, you must first assume that it is permitted. And only if after studying the early authorities, you do not find any possibility of leniency, only then are you obligated to forbid it. Unfortunately, I know many rabbis who are great scholars, but since their awe is greater than their wisdom, they first rule on a question out of the systematic assumption that it is surely unkosher and forbidden. And thus they frequently stumble and cause monetary losses to a Jew, which is a greater sin than the one between man and God. All right, so he spent some time talking about this idea that is present. He gives a date, since pretty much 1876 is the date that he gives. There is a tendency towards chumras, towards stringencies that we find in certain segments of the Jewish world. And this, he advocates and argues, is a new thing. This idea that we always have to go for the strictest or most not lenient position. He says, actually, the tradition indicates otherwise. And if you look at it, the idea that we're going to cause monetary loss to Jews is operative. And the example that I often give is one of my favorite yearly radio talk shows, comes on the Motzei Shabbat right before Pesach. A little radio station by the name of Talkline Communications out of Borough Park broadcasts a 2-hour session from about 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. in which all of the Orthodox, mostly home wives, will call in and ask about what is kosher or not kosher for Passover. And sometimes it's really fascinating. And the ones I like, one I remember, which if you think about this principle, we don't want to be strict causing monetary loss, was one time a woman called and said, what about my bounty paper towels? Can I use those? Are they kosher for Pesach? Well, what do you think the rabbi from the OU said? Yeah, he said, you can use the bounty paper towels so long as it's not the first couple of paper towels in the roll or the last couple of paper towels in the roll, because the glue that is used to keep the towels affixed to the roll might have kitniyot in it. Now, that seems to me as a stringency that would cause monetary damage. So unnecessary monetary damage. I think those are the type of stringencies that Rabbi Galinkin is pointing out to. And in fact, it was Rabbi Galinkin's teshuvah, which we talked about this weekend, that opened up kitniyot to Ashkenazim in general. He wrote a teshuvah 20 years ago saying that the emphasis on avoiding rice and beans amongst Ashkenazim is not based on strong halacha, and also detracts from the real purpose of Passover, which is the avoidance of leaven. We're so obsessed with avoiding corn and corn syrup that we have lost the narrative thread, was Rabbi Galinkin's opinion. And ultimately that opinion got adopted by the American conservative movement just a few years back. Any thoughts about these first two? One, we want to preserve the tradition, and two, our inclination is a priori to be lenient. Susan.
I would just change the word the tradition to a tradition, because Jewish civilization has included a lot more than halachically following Jews who follow halakha. So
This here. It's just it's a good point. It's a good point, and I want to make it clear what Susan is pointing out here. So give me a second here while I zoom out. When he talks about tradition, thank you, Susan. When conservative Jews talk about the tradition, they mean this page. They mean the rabbinic tradition. They mean the Talmud. They mean the Mishnah. They mean the Tanakh, and they mean the Responsa and the Shulchan Aruch. That, when you see tradition and change by Rabbi Waxman in 1954, he means that page, those traditions, those rabbinic laws, and guidance and rules, plus change. Thank you. I think that's important to point out. Other questions or comments?
Are we going to get to the change piece?
Let's take a look. Let's keep going. All right. When do we get to the change piece? Ben wants to know. All right. So let's.
Well, because the tradition, it's very clear what it is. I mean, or at least within the parameters that you've just pointed out, we can point to a thing and say, this is the tradition. It's much harder to point to what hasn't happened yet and say, this is the change.
We're going to get to it. To answer Howard's question really quickly, the Sephardim didn't have the prohibition on rice and beans. That was only in Ashkenaz land, so it's unfamiliar to them. That was just a chumrah or a stringency that got applied in Ashkenaz territories. All right, so let's go to number 3. Before giving a halachic ruling, the subject is studied in a historic, scientific fashion. Here you go, Ben. In order to determine if the law or custom derives from the Torah, the Talmudic sages, the early rabbis, or the later rabbis. It is also ascertained whether the practice under discussion has been adopted by the entire Jewish community or not. There is more readiness to change a relatively new halacha, one which has not been adopted by the entire Jewish community, or something which is only a custom. For example, the Sephardim eat rice and beans. The Ashkenazim don't eat rice and beans. That hasn't been adopted by the whole community. That happens to not be halakha. It happens to just be custom. It happens to be relatively new in the 11th or 12th century as opposed to in the 1st century. Therefore, we can be more change-oriented, Ben, depending on how new that law is and if it's been adopted uniformly by the whole community, and something also that perhaps is just a custom and it's not a law, but also gives room for flexibility there. Okay. Still insufficient, I know, but we're going to move on here, see if we can get down to the idea of change. So, and we're going to have a test case too that comes after this. So the Shulchan Aruch is a standard code of Jewish law, which is composed by Yosef Karo and Moshe Isserles in the 16th century, right? This code is certainly an important halachic source, but for several reasons, it should not be viewed as the ultimate authority, which is the common practice among Orthodox rabbis. First of all, the Shulchan Aruch was written 400 years ago, and much has changed since then in the halakha and society and in our outlook on life. Yes, that is, in the last 400 years, things definitely have changed a little bit. In addition, in the days of Yosef Karo and afterwards, many important halakhic authorities, such as Rabbi Shlomo Luria, who was the Maharashal, and Rabbi Mordechai Yafi, and Rabbi Samuel Eres, who's the Maharashah, and the Bach, and the Meir of Lublin, and the Chacham Tzvi, severely criticized those who decide the halakha according to the Shulchan Aruch without checking the Talmud and the major authorities who preceded Rabbi Yosef Karo. All right, so this idea is we're just going to take the Shulchan Aruch, we'll establish this, we don't have to look before the Shulchan Aruch because this was put together and we can count on Rabbi Yosef Karo, but it does seem like Rabbi Galinkin is pointing out that even afterwards, there were people who were willing to go back to the Talmudic sources that predated the Shulchan Aruch. Conservative rabbis followed those great authorities, as opposed to Orthodox rabbis who have elevated the Shulchan Aruch to the status of the Holy of Holies. Conservative Judaism remembers the cautionary words uttered by Salman Schachter a century ago. But however great the literary value of a code may be, it does not invest it with the attribute of infallibility, nor does it exempt the student or the rabbi who makes use of it from the duty of examining each paragraph on its own merit and subjecting it to the same rules of interpretation that were always applied to the tradition. And now right here in that number, in that paragraph, marks the clear dividing line between orthodoxy and conservatism. Conservatism is willing to question the Shulchan Aruch so long as we apply those methodologies of responsa and question and answering that have existed in the 1500 years prior to the Shulchan Aruch. As long as we are playing the same game, we feel that this generation has every right to play that game as the previous generations and every right to go back prior to the Shulchan Aruch to question that halacha. Orthodoxy does not do that. Ben.
Yeah, this question doesn't really relate to what we just said, but it is kind of a beef I have with the conservatives of its interpretation of halakha, perhaps, or maybe it doesn't have anything to do with halakha. I don't know. It seems like a lot of this is framed around what's permissible. And the conservative movement makes decisions about what is permissible, but doesn't necessarily indicate what's normative. And what struck me was that we just got new prayer books, right? New Sidurim that were published pretty recently. What, 5 years ago, something like that, right? Brand new, relatively speaking, brand new, right? Reflecting the latest and greatest thinking of the conservative movement. And still, when you come to the Amida, you've got one side with the patriarchs and one side with the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Why do we have a prayer that excludes the matriarchs? Have we not been able to decide as a movement, including the women as well as men in this prayer is normative? But clearly that didn't happen. What was decided is, well, it's permissible, but if you want to do it the old way, well, that's permissible too, and we're not going to make a decision about what's normative. And I wonder, that seems unusual, right? The Orthodox movement clearly makes decisions about what's normative. I think even the Reform movement makes decisions about what's normative, but the conservative movement tends not to. And I wonder whether that's explicit in our approach or how we think about that. We're supposed to.
So that is one of the unfortunate classic characteristics of conservative halacha. Its willingness to be ambiguous, its willingness to say yes and no simultaneously, and have it sit. And that is its calling card and its biggest hindrance. Lisa.
I don't know if there's an answer to my question, but I've always wondered how the Shulchan Aruch got such weight in the Orthodox world. I think that's where Kol Isha originates, right?
But I don't know for sure. But if it's in the Shulchan Aruch, it will not be superseded by Orthodox authority. The story that I tell is the story that Rabbi Roth told me when he was working on, here, I'll show you here. Maybe at some point we can take a look at this book, which is The Ordination of Women as Rabbis, Studies in Responsa, which comes out of the late 70s of the conservative movement, in which they were trying to figure out how can women serve as rabbis of communities. And Rabbi Roth used these principles. I don't know if he used exactly this formulation that Rabbi Galinkin has, but using these basic principles, entered into a study of the sources prior to the 1600s and found that there was a way that had halachic integrity, that was inside the system of Sheilot and Teshuvot, of responsa, as they've existed for 1,500 years. And he wrote a Teshuvah saying that women could serve and be ordained as rabbis. And he brought it to his mentor, who was, oh my goodness, his name is slipping my mind at the moment, but he brought it to his mentor, who was David Weiss Halivni. And he said to Rabbi Halivni, he said, take a look. And Halivni read it, gets back to him, and Halivni says, I've read it, Joel. It's good. It works. So Rabbi Roth says to him, okay, we'll sign it. And if you sign it, we'll be good. And Halivni says, I can't sign it. And Rabbi Roth says, why? He says, because it's never been said before. And at that moment, Rabbi Roth said he knew he was in a different movement from Rabbi David Weiss Halivni. That is sort of the key, where orthodoxy willing to go, or I mean, Halivni wasn't Orthodox, but he was certainly more, I guess, traditional than Rabbi Roth was. Susan.
My understanding of, I mean, I think this is fascinating that the conservative movement looks to Talmud first. I never knew that. And my understanding of the Shulchan Aruch is that it started in the East, the Jews who are in the Arab countries, and they're looking at Sharia law, and they say, where's our Sharia? Give us our Sharia. And that's really the origin of it. It's this desire for absolutes and certainty that was in Sharia, and they got it. And they got it in the Shulchan Aruch. I personally, I've been really traumatized by that stuff because I grew up with it. And so I think that's really fascinating. But also the Talmud, doing Daf Yomi, the sages are always saying, well, is this Torah or is this rabbinic? Is this Torah or is this rabbinic? And they debate it, and they often do not come to conclusions.
That's right.
And so there's tons of I mean, it can be really quite flexible, and in fact, there are new movements, there's a group of people studying who consider themselves fairly marginal, studying Talmud now in a whole new way. So
it's pretty cool. I mean, no, it's pretty awesome. Lisa?
She answered. Thank you. That's fascinating.
I think it is. Look, there's always, what's the great mark of the Tanakh, right? What's the gift that the Jewish people brought to the world? We brought a document. I don't know, that had never before existed, and that document was a merging of narrative and law in the same document. Okay, we have narrative and law in one document. We have prose and poetry in one document. That's the Tanakh. And then after the destruction of the temple, and by the way, what a great novel thing to have narrative and law hung together. It's pretty rich life to live. But then after the destruction of the temple, the narrative and the law are decoupled, and you get the Mishnah, which is sort of the law without the narrative. But there's the tendency for we're Jews. So we have the Talmud, where we put the narrative back into the law. And then there becomes the codes, in which the narrative is again removed from the law, like Susan just expressed. And so here we are, conservative Jews, trying to bring the narrative back in. One really broad way to look at it. When he talks about societal influences, he talks about scientific understanding, he talks about where we are as a community, those are narrative factors. Those are factors that have to do with stories and civilization and sociology. And we're willing to consider those towards an effort to adjust our laws. Lisa, you look like you have a question.
So just to remind me, when the more Sharia-like impulse happened, when was that?
Well, I mean,
The Shulchan Aruch.
Rambam does it. I mean, I'm not going to place the blame exclusively on Yosef Karo. Rambam creates the Mishnah Torah. Rambam has the Guide for the Perplexed, which is right here. Here it is. He's got the Guide for the Perplexed, right there. Right. And what is the Guide for the Perplexed about? If you've read it recently, and some of you have, it's about noses and ears and eyes. Ben, we could have talked about this last night. Noses and ears and eyes and negative theology. That's not operable as a legal code at all. It's a book of philosophy. And then he has this other code, which is just what you're supposed to do and when, because it's really utilitarian to give that to people. And that is this sort of key dilemma, a part of, I don't think it's a new dilemma. I think it's about 3,000 years old between, is the story true or do you just follow the law? Let's take a look. Oh, yes, go right ahead.
So, there's just this very striking phrase that comes up sometimes in the Talmud when they're having a discussion about something, and one of the rabbis said, go out and see what the people are doing. It's amazing.
100, and that is Rabbi Roth and Rabbi Galinkin's point, which is go out and see was an operable and legitimate halachic category back in the time of the Talmud. And it should still be. That's
Saving the cow pads.
their point. That's right. You got to take a look at the cow patches. That's right. All right. So let's take a look here. The next one here, number 5, halachic pluralism. Here you go, Ben. This is the one that bothers you. Is maintained when there are 2 legitimate ways to rule on a halachic issue. In such a case, the Committee on Jewish Laws and Standards of the conservative movement publishes the majority and minority opinions, and every local rabbi, every Mara Da'atra is authorized to choose the ruling appropriate to his halachic point of view and the circumstances prevailing in his congregation. All right. So the local rabbi decide exactly, not a lot of help there, Ben. The local rabbi.
Well, I mean, this was a real problem, right? With the ruling on homosexuals in the rabbinate. This became a real problem. Many people, many synagogues left the movement because the conservative movement's ruling was, you don't have to be homophobic, but if you'd like to be, that's also okay. And it was sort of the worst of both worlds because it kind of, nobody was happy with it, right? It did not state it was a question of values and principles.
And that is the problem at the heart of the
punted.
movement. That's the problem at the heart of the
punted.
movement. That's a problem at the DNA of the movement.
Yes, I think if you're going to have a movement, any movement needs to have values and principles. Otherwise, it's not a movement. And to have a ruling like that says we refuse to issue
Take a position
of principle on this thing, we'll open the door for people to walk through if they have one set of values, but if people have if the opposite set of values, then we're okay with that too. And I think that turned out to be unhelpful and kind of destructive.
So there's a reason we're going to be talking about how to craft a new movement in the coming weeks, Ben, because some of the old ways of the conservative Judaism has been trying to apply for the past 30 years have not been working. And I think you're putting your finger on one of them. And I think that error or that dilemma is baked into the DNA of the movement. And it ends up with morally suspect conclusions like the one you just put forth. Number 6, much emphasis is placed on the moral component of Judaism and of the halacha. The mitzvot between man and man are no less important than the mitzvot between man and God. Keep far away from falsehood is no less important than remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Paying taxes is no less important than sitting in the sukkah. Our approach to issues of morality and halakha is nicely summarized by Rabbi Salanter, the founder of the Musar movement in the 19th century. Just as one checks for a drop of blood in an egg, thus must one check the kashrut of every penny that he earns. Just as the rabbi of the city must check the ritual slaughter knife for flaws, so must he check the weights and measures in the city in order to prevent deception. One should not be strict in the observance of the mitzvahs at the expense of others. I think this is a little bit of a screed against those who are meticulous at keeping shotness or, Shabbos or kashrus or bounty paper towels, but treat their employees terribly, but are, manipulative in money dealings, but don't operate honestly. I think he wants to be very critical of people who try to hide behind their immorality and their business with their sanctimoniousness of ritual observance. Sharonda asks, I wonder who does and who doesn't have standing to say when something isn't working. Oh God, what a beautiful, wonderful question. And I think Sharonda, not this week, but in next week and in subsequent weeks, that's exactly the question is going to come down to. Every denomination in Jewish life, and we've talked a little bit around the margins of this, but every denomination, Sharonda, in Jewish life is determined based upon the answer to that question. Who has the authority to decide this? And you'll see that authority is vested in different places throughout the denominations. The Reform movement places it in your head, okay? You're the authority, and you're deluding yourself if you think there's another authority, because really, who gets out of bed? It's you, okay? You have to choose to get out of bed. So you're the authority, and read the sources, read the text, and you decide, because you're the only one who controls you. That's Reform movement. Orthodoxy says the Shulhana, right? That's what Orthodoxy says. So we'll take a look at some of those, but I think that your question, Sharonda, sits at the heart of Jewish denominational life for the past 150 years. Now, I think what I'm going to do over the next few weeks is advocate for the establishment of a movement that does not use that question as the heart of how it defines itself. I think perhaps the era of 150 years of Jewish denominations determined by the authority of Jewish law might be past, and that there might be other ways in which Jews can be gathered as movements that isn't based exclusively on their opinion about if they're a strict constructionist or a loose constructionist. Okay, I think there might be other ways. I don't know yet what that is, but I think it could be a fun conversation for us to have on Wednesdays. So now let's take a look. That is each of his 6 principles. And now let's take a look at a live controversy. Which, can you see that? What do you guys see on your screen right now? Do you see?
Now we got it.
Is it permissible? Is the light in light of the spread of the coronavirus? You see that? That's not the one. That's not the right one. Okay.
Oh.
Virtual minyanim on weekdays. Is that the one you see now? All right.
Yes.
So this is a live controversy, as I told him when he presented it in Shul on Shabbat, and he had to decide this in March of 2020. So this is one of the teshuvot that he wrote in March of 2020. And in light of the 6 principles he gave, he pointed out that here was a tradition. So he begins by agreeing with the responsum of Rabbi Avram Reisner, which was approved by the CJLS in the year 2001. Does he give a question? He doesn't seem to give a question. He just goes right into it. That if there's a physical minyan, so here's the law as it exists in March of 2020, according to the history of where the conservative movement has held on using technological means for the purpose of counting a minyan. Now, why would you need to count a minyan? Well, I think just for those of you who might not be aware, if you don't have 10 people together in a space, you can't read the Torah ritually, you can't traditionally recite the mourner's Kaddish, you can't do the communal Amidah, You can't do the Chatzi Kaddish. We have these words that are holy words, which can only be recited in the presence, like the Baruch Hu, in the presence of a minyan. That's really, so the question is, all right, so in 2001, Rabbi Reisner and the conservative movement were asked this question. Well, can you get on a phone or an internet line and have 10 people connected and read the Torah or do the mourner's Kaddish? So Rabbi Reisner said, that's right. Until recently, women weren't included in a minyan. And Rabbi Roth goes into that at great depth in this book here, which we probably will take a look at, because I think it's going to be very on point with how he goes about it. If women can't be counted in a minyan, how can they be rabbis, right? That's a big question. So so he decided in 2001 that if there is a physical minyan of 10, one may join that minyan via the internet. Now, 2001, what did the internet look like, Ben? What did the internet look like in 2001?
Yeah, different. We wouldn't be doing this.
We couldn't be doing this. So to join a minyan via
you
an
could.
internet.
There were video conferencing. There was video conferencing technology, but it wasn't widespread like it is today. You just probably wouldn't think of it. The technology existed, but it hadn't kind of reached the masses the way that it has now.
And I think that's important because it doesn't matter this pixel rate, I think is
well, yeah, and if and who had the bandwidth, right? I mean,
right.
People just didn't.
But they're
have
still
the
allowing.
bandwidth.
But he's still going to allow it so long as there are 10 people at the site. So, for example, if we have 10 people in our chapel, you can, if you even very sloppily in 2001 can connect to the internet and can connect to our chapel, you can recite the Kaddish via the internet if one of the people in the physical minyan recites the Kaddish as well. All right, so as long as the Kaddish is being said amongst that minyan, you can, back in 2001 in your AOL dial-up, say the Kaddish. This is in keeping, Rabbi Galinkin says, with the Shulchan Aruch and the sources in the Talmud and the Tosfot cited by Rabbi Reisner. Please read Rabbi Reisner's response for other crucial details. All right, so that's the pretty much the rule in the movement prior to the pandemic, is that you need 10 people in a physical space. And then after you have that, anyone else can check in. Now, more recently, Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef wrote an unpublished responsum in November of 2016, which rules that a person living in a remote location may join a physical minyan of 10 via the internet and answer amen to dvarim she b'kedusha, which those are the prayers I just mentioned that you need 10 for, things which require a minyan. And he says that he is basing himself on what he wrote in the Yalkut Yosef, and he stresses twice that he heard from his father, Rabbi Vaji Yosef, not a conservative rabbi, that one may answer amen and the 13 attributes of God when joining slichot over the internet. Neither of them seems to have addressed the question as to whether a mourner may recite the Kaddish while participating remotely. Okay, so he wants you to know that Vaji Yosef's own son says, if you're living in a remote location, you can answer amen to the Baruch Hu if there's a minyan there. So even amongst Rabbi Vaji Yosef was one of the biggest chief Sephardi rabbi, posek. Marcia.
My husband had an opportunity to talk to Rabbi Galinkin, and he asked him if there was ever a time when people, what did you do with somehow they were talking during the bubonic plague.
Yeah, great question.
And you had to sit Shiva. Well, they decided that, you couldn't have other people come into your house to sit Shiva with you because it was just too dangerous. But you could still say the Kaddish. And I'm thinking, wait a minute here. They didn't have 10 people. How come they could say the Kaddish then and we can't say the Kaddish now?
Did Stan get an answer?
No, he was taken away, which is really heartbreaking because, that's sort of the gist, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think, we might not be in the same movement as Rabbi Galinkin. And I think it's worthwhile to consider that. Is the way he's answering the questions the way that we as a community want to answer these questions? Susan.
Well, I actually, it has been said by some people that Orthodoxy has become way more Orthodox in reaction to conservative Judaism. And earlier, even way back when, during the bubonic plague, Orthodoxy wasn't as rigid as it is now. So it may, I mean, Karen Armstrong has a whole theory about fundamentalism, that it's a reaction to modernism, and that so Orthodoxy is not traditional, it's new, it's a new movement.
That's exactly right. And in that link I just put, that's the brief synopsis of his talk from Friday on who is a Jew and the conversion crisis. Very short, I'll tell you that it comes down to exactly what you're saying, Susan, which is the establishment of a more stringent position with regard to converts than had ever previously existed. And that stringency came out in response perhaps to the German Reformation. And that was to say that a convert had to commit to keeping all of the commandments. And if the convert didn't keep all of the commandments, you could retroactively revoke their conversion status. Now, this is offensive and immoral to Rabbi Galinkin. And on top of that, it's also not traditional, because that has never been the operative rule of converts, that they should be asked to fulfill all of the commandments. And in that text there, he explains that. But we probably don't have time to cover that at the moment, but it's really interesting because he talks about the Talmudic lesson, which is there, which I can see if I can pull it up very quickly. The Talmudic lesson, ultimately, he says that in 1876, here it is, Rabbi Yitzchak Schmeckles penned a revolutionary responsum. And he says, a person who converts and accepts the yoke of the mitzvot, but does not intend in his heart to observe them, God desires the heart, and he is not a convert. 1876. This approach had no precedent in 2,000 years of Jewish law. That just wasn't the case. And he goes through and explains how the other standard was more operable. But hold on with your questions, because I do want to get through the internet teshuva, and I let that diversion go on a little bit too long, but I think it's on point. So let me just go back, because I do want to get through the internet teshuva. All right. During the current crisis, everyone have this now? During the current crisis, the RA published CJLS guidance for remote minyanim in a time of COVID-19, and the majority still agree with Rabbi Reisner's teshuva. This letter offers another option of a remote minyan where all 10 people are in different locations based on their understanding of Orach Chaim and on recent responsum by Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein of Bnei Brak. Let me read that again, because I didn't understand that. During the current crisis, the RA published these guidance, and they still agree with Reisner's teshuva. But, which is the word I missed the last time, that letter offers another option for a remote minyan where all 10 people are in different locations. I missed that the first time. Based on their understanding of Orach Chaim and a recent responsa by Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein. Okay, so that published by the CJLS, just so we're clear, said majority still agree with the 2001 rule, but there's another option, Ben Chin's minority report, which he can't stand, which mucks everything up. But there's another option here. And this other option, I do not find this convincing, he says, because what Orach Chaim is talking about, he doesn't really give us, I'll explain this, is talking about one person in a minyan who can be seen via a window, not 10, while Rabbi Zilberstein is talking about 10 people who are standing in the same cemetery and who can see and hear each other. So in Orach Chaim 55:14, it basically says if you're walking by a shul and there's a minyan at the shul and there is a window to that minyan, you can respond yes if you're looking through the window. And so that rabbi, modern idea, another option says, well, great, I'm on a window now. You're on a window now. There are 10 of us looking at these windows, whatever you want to call them. Let's apply that Orach Chaim view and allow everyone to be on their windows. Now, Rabbi Galinkin spoke on Saturday. He disagreed with that. He says primarily because there aren't 10 windows. You're talking about one window with 10 people. He thought it was a little bit too fanciful to imagine that all 10 people are on windows when the Talmudic source is talking about only one person looking through a window and a minyan going on inside. All right, I think that was explained. Now the letter offers a third opinion. He says one person in a minyan who can be seen via a window, not 10. And Zilberstein is talking about 10 people who are standing in the same cemetery. So he makes a distinction there. The letter offers a third opinion that an online minyan of 10 people in 10 locations is allowed for the recitation of the mourner's Kaddish. And I'm embarrassed to say this is what we do. Rabbi Galinkin is critical here. This is our approach. We do include the mourner's Kaddish on our online minyanim. I think if you've been attending them, you know that we do say it. Since the Kaddish is not listed in the Devarim Shebekdusha in Mishnah Megillah, I find this approach very problematic. Okay, so Rabbi Galinkin finds what we've been doing problematic. In order to allow people to recite the Kaddish via the internet, we must demote the Kaddish and say it is not a real Devar Shebekdusha, not a real word of holiness. This means that when the current crisis ends, people can say that since it's not in the Mishnah Megillah, we may recite it without a minyan. So basically what he's saying is that once the crisis ends, now that we've demoted the status of the mourner's Kaddish by creating this distinction that it's not mentioned as one of these holy words in the Mishnah, then we've lost the special status that we've given it. And he doesn't want to do that. He thinks that's unfortunate. Similarly, Rabbi Benny Lau recently asked Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, a well-known Israeli religious Zionist posek, what may be recited in a Zoom tefillah. Rabbi Melamed replied that such a meeting is not a minyan and Devarim Shebekdusha may not be recited. He says reciting the Kaddish Tome and the Kaddish D'Rabbanan do not include a bracha levatala, which is a blessing in vain. And therefore, this electronic connection can be considered me'ain minyan, a pseudo minyan. All right, so Rabbi Benny Lau, I think he's the chief rabbi. He basically called this a pseudo minyan, and therefore you could not say the mourner's Kaddish. Galinkin says, I don't know what a pseudo minyan is, but I don't recommend it. Therefore, Galinkin concludes, if a physical minyan is no longer possible due to the virus, Jews can gather for communal prayer via the internet and skip the Devarim Shebekdusha, such as the Kaddish Baruch Hu and the Kedusha. This is what we do. Okay, so that is the practice at Beth Shalom. In such a case, mourners can recite one of the prayers which has been composed for mourners who are not able to join a minyan. We do not apply that rule because we consider there to be a social, pastoral, community value of the mourner's Kaddish. It's interesting, he frames it as being less than, we frame it as being more than. Our minyan has always held our community together because we provided a place for people to sit at Kaddish and to have yard sites. And going through a pandemic, to have that not be in place, we disagreed in that case with Rabbi Galinkin. Okay, 5 minutes left. Thoughts? Aubrey Lurie. Aubrey hasn't said anything yet. You want to get in here, Aubrey? Come on in. You got to mute yourself. Unmute. Ask to unmute. All right, I'll come back to you. Are you, Aubrey? He's typing something. All right, I think Aubrey's going to.
There
Oh, there
we
you
are.
go. There you go, Aubrey.
I'm unmuted. You know, it's quite interesting because I find all this very interesting, and I really admire your synagogue, our synagogue, and I think it's very nice and it's wonderful. But it troubles me because a lot of these things are not so important that it can decide whether you belong as a Jew or not. I mean, it doesn't really matter. And it doesn't matter because Jews are singularly thinking on their own. And they're not going to agree with so many things. Again, that doesn't matter. The essence of it all is to be a mensch, is to do the right thing, is to say these are the options, but there's no right or wrong here.
And so Aubrey's point is Galinkin has it right, but his mistake is coming down too hard. I think you think methodologically or philosophically, you're okay with a pluralistic choice environment, but the attention to the minutia and what could be perceived as nourishkeit and acting that it's still that the decision of the rabbi is still in any way operable is a little hard to stomach. And I think Ben Chin, who's got his hand raised, agrees with you on this point. Ben.
That what? That it doesn't matter?
Well, that it's a mistake to try to impose these laws on this minutia is what Aubrey, I think, is saying. It misses the point, and it does.
Oh, I don't
and
think
we're
this is
so
minutia.
singularly.
I don't believe this is minutia.
Okay, so go on. I put that word in his mouth. That wasn't the word Aubrey used. You talk.
I think. I mean, maybe I think this is more important than Aubrey thinks it is. It gets at all kinds of really interesting issues. And you know, how we're supposed to relate to each other, how we're supposed to treat different kind of contexts, you know, of being together, what we even think being together really means. I mean, my opinion is this: what we're doing now, this is not being in a class together. This is not the experience of being in a room discussing. It's something else. Not that it doesn't have value, right? But it's just not the same thing. And what occurred to me was just how we want to think about how we set ourselves apart in terms of how we behave and our lifestyle. And the one thing that occurred to me is during this pandemic, like many other people, especially people in San Francisco, I started fantasizing about other places I could live, right? As a lot of people have. A lot of people have moved out of San Francisco during this pandemic. I'm not planning on doing that, but of course the thought occurred to me, like, well, where else could I live? What kind of a different life could I have? And, you know, thought about all the different places in the, you know, in this country at least, where I could go. And you know, sometimes the thought would occur to me and I'm like, no, I can't live there. There's no Jews there.
Right.
And that's important. Right. It's important. I mean, to me, at least right now, and I think through most of our history, that has been meaningful. We need to be physically around other Jews in order to be able to live our life as Jews. And in a world where that doesn't matter anymore, I think it's a very different world. And you have people making very different kinds of choices. I don't think that's a small thing.
So this is interesting because this is, Aubrey, did you want to say something? Go right ahead.
No, well, carry on. You finish and then I'll have a word.
Well, I was going to say, this is exactly sort of the area Marcia and Stan and Rabbi Galinkin had a little bit of a back and forth about this. And it's interesting because Marcia, when he was talking to you, he didn't list any of those 6 categories that we just studied. Did you notice what he said to you? Why? He said to you, because it'll shut synagogues down. He didn't use any of the 6 as the operative reason for why he was opposed to virtual minyanim, but he said he's opposed to them because they will shut shuls down. And I thought that was it. That wasn't one of the 6. He answered you with something that was a 7. And at seventh in consider. I thought that was interesting, Marcia. I see your hand is raised, so I just wanted to give you a chance, and then we'll come to Hope and to Aubrey afterwards. Did you want to say something here, Marcia?
Well, actually, and I listened to that and I thought, that's a sad commentary of synagogues. That they don't, that's a way of saying that the physical synagogue doesn't have that much to offer. That's different. And that's a sad commentary. And what I think it means to the physical synagogue is that it has to make itself relevant.
That's right.
It has to provide something that people can't get on Zoom. And this is something that the synagogue
It
has
has
to
to have
do
value. That's
forever.
right.
It's had to change or adapt or whatever to reach the needs of the people that they want to attract or they want to retain. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Synagogues have always morphed and changed the way they do things to meet the changing demographic.
And it seemed to me you could have responded very quickly by saying, well, we'll save the shul by reaching more people, right? I mean, it seemed to me like if you're using that as the category to decide it, then you really have leapt off of the six. Okay, so let me move to Aubrey and then Hope, because they're trying to get in here.
One thing, the recent epidemic had brought some interesting lessons to us. And I'll give you an example about the very Orthodox not being in favor of vaccinations. I mean, that sort of thing, and their followers won't undergo the vaccination despite all the evidence that it'll protect people from getting the illness. And that to me is inexcusable. And I'll give you an example. There was a situation in Israel where in one of these very religious groups, a pregnant woman got ill. She got the COVID infection and she died, leaving behind a family of 4 or 5 kids. And the Rabbonim in charge of that particular group said they were convinced that this was outrageous and that they must encourage their people to listen to science and to listen to the objections that they might have to the vaccination. And that particular group, I believe, came out with an instruction that all their members had to be vaccinated.
And Rabbi Galinkin did the same thing. And when he was here, he talked about that we as a movement take science into consideration and that is a part of it and that we don't want to be in that fundamentalist world in which we will not accept science. And that's an awful story, Aubrey.
It is an awful story. And I don't care what other people believe, but it must be to the betterment of the group and the individual. And if they want to do whatever they do, as long as it doesn't impinge on the general health and lifestyle of the people that they're supposed to be serving.
Yep. Amen. Hope?
Well, so I'm just wondering, is there anything in the literature? Everything that I've read has been very concrete. If this, then this is, where I'm going with this. Is there anything that says, and if something happens that we haven't accounted for, then this is how halakha or other guidance applies?
Yeah. So let me see if I can find it. Do you have a prayer book? Do you have a weekday prayer book? If you go and open up your weekday prayer book right at the front of I'm trying to see if I have one here. Right at the front of the Siddur, in the morning, there are a list of Talmudic principles, maybe if you recall coming to Minyan. And those are, I wish I had them. I wish I had the Siddur. Hold on.
You want me to see if I can grab one?
Hold on. I think I might have a digital one. Hold on.
Okay.
Yeah, here it is. Weekday Siddur. 1 second. So here, take a look at this.
Okay.
Because we actually daven them. Of course we do. There are basic rules that exist for how to answer questions that come up. And we consider those rules to be worthwhile to daven. So I'll show them to you. here.
And do they apply then to circumstances that we had never, ever conceived of, such as a pandemic and Zoom?
And that is exactly what Rabbi Galinkin is saying. Rabbi Galinkin is saying, sorry that it's taken me a while to get this, but here it is. Rabbi Galinkin is saying that these rules here, we can still use. We don't have to defer to the rabbis in the 1600s. We don't have to defer to them in the 1600s because these rules are still in operation. Here it is. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, B'shalosh asara midot hatara need rashet. All right, so let me translate for you. Rabbi Ishmael says the Torah may be expounded by these 13 rules of textual interpretation. It's right there in the Birkot HaShachar on page 12. I wonder how many of you even noticed it. An inference may be drawn from one premise to another that is more inclusive or to another that is less inclusive. An inference may be drawn from a similar phrase in two texts. A comprehensive principle may be derived from a single text or from two related texts. A rule which appears general, but is followed by one or more particulars, is limited to those particulars. So there's all of these rules. We put them in our prayer book to daven them, but those are the rules that are operable that Rabbi Galinkin is saying, we can still apply those rules, Rabbi Roth too. We can still apply those rules today. We don't have to be locked into the Shulchan Aruch's interpretation of it. Susan.
No, I'm just curious about where this is going in the next few weeks. Is it really about becoming more post-denominational? Is that where you're going? Or is it about being real solid in conservative Judaism? I mean, I ask because I'm not sure
Well, I don't,
if I want to be here for that, because
I'm more interested in the former as opposed to the latter. I'm guessing you are too.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
maybe there is
I
a
wouldn't be
denomination
here.
in which you and I could sit together.
Yeah.
Like maybe, by the way, maybe there isn't, and that's fine. We can study
Mhm.
together, but we don't have to sit in the same denomination. But maybe your notion of Jewish authority is different from my notion of Jewish authority. It just
Right.
is. You're a humanistic rabbi. I'm a conservative rabbi. We determine halakha differently. But does that mean we have to be in different movements? That's ultimately, I think, the question I want to ask.
No, I'm
Because-
very interested in that question.
Because
So-
for the last 150 years, we've decided if we're in the same movement based upon our answers to the question of authority. And I'm not sure that that still has to be the case. Marv.
You know, it seems like the majority of Jews have voted by deciding not to be in any movement. So I'm not quite sure where we're going. Is the idea, what's the matter with having a number of movements? We don't want to get rid of those people. Maybe we want to figure out how to get people who aren't in any movements into some of the movements. But you know, in the internal conversation that we continually carry on with ourselves, I superficially use as my reference the line that we're a kingdom of priests. So, you know, I take my life experience and I sort of say to myself, well, what is right and what is just, as has been said here. And I try to figure out how I go my own way.
Well, so we're 10 minutes over, but I'm going to ask you one question anyway, Marv. Where's your authority? What do you consider to be authoritative in the realm of religious law?
Oh, that's an easy question. Betty.
I think that's a good way to answer. The buck stops there. Thank you. So we're going to continue this. And Susan, I think first of all, how in the past 150 years have we created these movements? And then ultimately, Marv, what you're saying is what I'm trying to accomplish is, are these movements, which are reflective of the time and place in which they were developed, still helpful in getting the masses of people to want to be Jews and to participate? Or are these movements actually more harmful because they're married to older conceptions of authority and whatnot that people just don't want to have anything to do with? I don't know the answer to that question. but it's the one that I've pretty much been spending my life on for the past 20 years. So thank you for engaging, and we're going to go next week. I think what's interesting, and I'm tempted to go next week to the Treifa banquet and the Pittsburgh platform. For those of you who might not be familiar, the establishment of the Reform movement famously came about at a banquet in which they served shellfish to the rabbis, and they came up with a platform for the future of Judaism, which was the establishment of the Reform movement called the Pittsburgh Platform. So I'm tempted to begin there next week. All right. So I wish everyone a good rest of the day, and thanks for engaging in a great talk. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.